morning. The organizers told me I could not speak until the music stopped. So we're going to talk about the international dimension, focusing on 27 countries, in particular, the European Union. And I'm not going to sugarcoat things. I'm going to start with the challenges that we have, and then hopefully end with some optimism. Europe as a whole is not doing terribly well when it comes to the digital revolution. Of the world's top 100 technology companies, 10 were founded in Europe. Of European small businesses, only 8% do cross-border business within Europe, in spite of having a common market, a digital single market, and that number hasn't changed in 5 years. Only 34% of European companies use cloud, AI, or data services in their work and their production, and European tech companies' share of global ICT revenue was 11% in 2022. So we have some work to do. Now, where Europe has excelled in the last decade, especially in the last 5 years, is managing the risks and the downside of the digital revolution. So whether we're talking about monopoly power of big tech companies, misinformation being spread on social media, cyber attacks, misuse of personal data, ethical questions of AI, Europe has done a lot and has been fairly successful. I mean, let's look at our record in the last couple of years in cybersecurity. We have been under constant Russian cyber attack, Estonia particularly so, but countries throughout Europe. And the real news is that there hasn't been news. Europe has not been brought to its knees. Banking has not stopped working. The trains have not stopped running, with some small exceptions. So the investments we've made into cyber to deal with that risk have worked. We've passed legislation in the form of the Digital Services Act and other bits of legislation to make social media take down hate speech and take down politically manipulative content, deal with foreign-funded interference in elections. Europe has taken resolute action on the monopoly power of big tech companies. It's maybe too early to assess whether it's effective. The GDPR has become a global norm. And even in the US, we hear many people saying, actually, on some of these regulatory questions, Europe has got it right, and there's a model here that we should be following in America and globally on how to manage technology. And so that leads to the traditional saying that America innovates, China copies, and that's unfair to China these days, and Europe regulates. So that's a positive thing. The other thing that's really a bright spot is digital government. Many of the world's most digitized public sectors and best digital public services are still in Europe. Estonia, of course, but also Denmark, Portugal, countries across Europe, partially based on the long tradition of good public service that we have in Europe, partially, in the case of countries like Estonia, more recent innovation. I say still because when I look at what's happening outside of Europe, I think that we may have to give that crown up to some countries in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia pretty soon. But even there, and I should say the success, don't get me wrong, there's some really cool stuff going on, and I think if you ask me what the future of digital government is, and hopefully you will all be talking about this for the next 2 days, what's going to happen in the next couple of years in AI will be pretty incredible. We're doing some very interesting things here in Estonia. I think within 5 years' time, we'll all have our personal agents running around, combining data, public funding, resources, to give everyone their own tailored bouquet of services. But even there, the European dimension has not delivered as much as we would have liked. I remember 10 years ago, I went to Brussels, and some other Estonians came too. We had Andrus Ansip, who was the vice president for the digital single market. And one of the goals we set for ourselves was to bring Estonian principles of digital government to the entire EU. Cross-border EID and digital signatures, cross-border public services, the once-only principle. The good news is, it's all legislated. We have a bunch of legal acts, some of which we passed more than 5 years ago. The bad news is, it's not working yet. The so-called single digital gateway, which will make 21 public services work across Europe, everything from prescriptions to proving your address and doing things like bank compliance checks. Well, we passed the legislation in 2017. In 2025, November of 2025, we will finally have a deadline for the services coming online, and that's assuming we meet all the deadlines. Similarly, digital signature, we've now had digital signature legislation for more than a decade, but in practice it doesn't work. And now we have a new round of legislation on digital signatures, EIDAS 2. We're all building digital identity wallets, and those should get done in 2026 or 27. So Europe has to pick up the pace a bit, also when it comes to digital government, if it wants to build on the individual successes we have to have a collective success. And so the question is, if Europe is good at managing the risks and there are some good cases of digital government, is this enough? And I would resolutely say no. We are entering an entirely new era of computing. And I believe all the hype on AI. I think that the impact of deep learning and generative AI will be at least as big as the personal computer and the internet in the 90s. If you want sort of what I still think is the best explanation on why, then Mark Andreessen's essay last year on why AI will save the world, which you can Google as soon as I'm done talking, is a very good essay. But the problem is that China and the US are winning the AI race by every single measure. Investment, number of companies, number of patents, number of models trained. They're beating Europe, and they're also beating everyone else, to be clear. This isn't just a Europe versus China and the US, it's a rest of the world problem. And in Europe's case, we have many of the preconditions. We have the data, we have the infrastructure, we have investments into cutting-edge technology, high-performance computing, quantum, we have the research institutions, we have the talent, but we have to bring it together into commercial success and to services. And so what I hope for the European agenda, and we have European elections coming in 2 weeks, and then we'll have a new European Commission that will be putting a new agenda onto the table, is that in spite of all these challenges, we maintain a sense of urgency and a sense of optimism. Because we do need a positive agenda for Europe, just like we need to have positive agendas for digital transformation in all of our countries. And what I want to spend the next couple of minutes talking about is what that agenda might consist of. And this isn't just my own views, this is sort of what's being talked about across Europe, what we see politicians talking about, what we see think tanks talking about. And there will basically, I think, be three components to what might be a digital agenda and a broader economic and security agenda for Europe in the next 5 years. The first of these, kind of back to the basics, is a single market and a transformation of the European economy. And this isn't just a digital question, but if we think about the changes that have to happen to Europe's economy, a lot of them have to do with technology. Because there are many places where, in spite of the 30-year-old single market, Europe is not really integrated. The biggest of these, and this affects tech a lot, relates to capital. 300 billion euros a year flows from European pension funds and investors to the US, where it funds American companies that then will come and buy up European companies and Latin American companies and African companies. So basically, we're funding the Americans taking us over if it's not the Chinese. And in Europe's case, a lot of the challenge relates to the fact that our capital markets remain fragmented. We have many stock markets, we have national banking markets, things like our pension funds don't work across borders. And if we can consolidate that, we can bring larger amounts of private capital to support the tech sector. And also, by the way, that's good for the public sector because that means we have to put less public money into the whole chain of innovation and investment. Beyond that, we've been talking for years, and we really need to make a reality of a fifth freedom. So the single market has 4 freedoms: the free movement of capital, labor, people, and goods. The fifth freedom is data and knowledge. So that is data itself, that's having data available, that's European-wide data spaces so that a small company in Estonia can train on the healthcare data or the mobility data of Portuguese and Italians to get that scale effect. It's also how universities collaborate. It's how people with professional qualifications can move from one country to another. This is all work that we haven't done in the single market yet. And we have to integrate sectors that are still quite fragmented at a national level. We talked about banking, but it's also true for transport, for energy, for telecommunications, and in particular, for the complex service sectors that are really the bedrock of a modern economy. So healthcare, for instance, still very much a national domain in Europe. And the result of all of that is if you're an Estonian company doing very cool things in health tech, you have a huge challenge scaling across Europe, and you might as well just go to the US, as many do. Now that's an economic strategy. There is a core technology strategy too. And in my mind, the challenge is to stop talking about legislation and technology at a European level and start talking about outcomes. So Europe has set what it calls the digital decade goals, things like gigabit internet for every European, 75% of European companies using AI, and we have to get better at a multinational level of using all the tools that we have at government's disposals. Yes, regulation, but also funding, government working plans, PPPs to support these goals. And I think from my perspective, again, AI adoption is the #1 metric we really have to worry about. And a lot of the change that we have to make at a European level also relates not just to new legislation, but governance, how we implement the rules we have. The GDPR is a good example. Great norms, wonderful things. You know, if, as a consumer and a user, you read about the data protection rules that Europe has, you think, of course I want companies to follow these rules. But then the problem is we have 42 different data protection jurisdictions in Europe, because every German federal state is its own entity at the equivalent level of a national government. And those 42 different data protection authorities all have their own interpretation of those common European rules. So, economy, technology, and now there's a third focus that's new for Europe, and that's security. We will likely have a defense commissioner in the next European Commission, and this is a new thing for Europe, because Europe has generally left defense collaboration here on the continent to NATO. Today, most European countries realize that we have to become better at relying on ourselves. We have to think about our strategic autonomy in key sectors, including chips, batteries, and that's to address a technological dependence on China, but also a dependence on the US, which, let's just say, is a very dynamic place politically these days. And this brings us to the global question. President Macron recently delivered a speech in the Sorbonne calling for a Europe that is better at doing sovereignty. Now, Estonians used to be skeptical of this idea. We saw that as traditional French protectionism. But with what's happened in the world in the last few years, I think many in small, open countries like Estonia are starting to see the merit in thinking very hard about dependence on other parts of the world and how we interact. And this puts us in the place of a bit of a dilemma, because Europe's role in the world is always one, well, we've viewed it as one of openness, of trying to engage with the rest of the world, of trading openly. And we have to stop being naive about China, about US protectionism, but we also have to remain open to the rest of the world. And in particular, we have to remain open to countries that share our values and that share our goals. And so one of the things we have to think through is how we maintain supply chains that, on the one hand, free us of dependence of any one country, but are not closed down to Europe, and that this focus on geopolitics and sovereignty does not mean a closed Europe. And so I'd like to maybe finish with 3 calls to action. To Estonians, we can't go alone. We need to have a European agenda, and we should not have any kind of fantasy that Estonia can do digital well without a Europe that does digital well too. To Europeans, again, one of optimism. There's good news there too. For instance, this last year, there were more Europeans coming back to Europe to do technology here than there were Europeans moving to the US to work in tech companies. And there's a lot of political will to make change. You know, we look today, traditionally we might have said that France or Germany is an obstacle to innovation. We look today at how France and Germany are behaving when it comes to regulatory discussions. They're often much more open and liberal than other countries in the EU. And to those outside of Europe, what I want to say is that we're in this boat together. We're all trying to figure out, as countries that aren't the US and China, how we can prosper and thrive in the digital era, how our governments can provide good services, how we can deal with the risks of digitization. And my hope is that we can listen to you and that we can have a good discussion here in these rooms in the next 2 days about how the funding, the engagement, the capital that Europe has still can help build links with Africa, with Latin America, with Asia, with North America, and that we can all do well together. And with that, I think we have some time for questions that I think Hannes is moderating.
So, thanks, Luukas, for those great insights, and I really appreciate your views. So, I'm taking the first point from your last point, that we need to speak together more. But what about this dialogue? I think yesterday I heard, when we had the ministerial lunch, really great discussion between Africa and LATAM. without any moderation needed from US, Europe, or China. So this was really smart and likely discussion. So why we think that they at all need us Europeans?
I don't think they need us any more than we need them. I think at this point we all need each other equally. You know, as an Estonian, the experience that I've had, and that I think many other Estonians have had in the room, is that 20 or 30 years ago, we kind of made fun of Western Europeaners for being slow and bureaucratic. And sometimes, with many of the countries in the room here, I've experienced this working, in particular with Ukraine, we feel like the slow and the bureaucratic ones. So I would say there's a lot of win-win, but you're absolutely right. The conversation is absolutely one of equals, and there are places where the best in the world is not being done in Europe or the US.
Yeah, and I truly believe that a lot of innovation is actually happening in Asia, not only in China, meaning much broadly in Asia, a lot in Africa. If you're taking mobile money, it was born in Africa and still doing much better than whatever other region. There is a lot of good samples of citizen engagement from Latin America. Let's take I
do want to dash the optimism a little bit.
Yeah.
And it's again, I think AI is changing things again because we have this next round of technological innovation, and right now the massive preponderance of the capital and the talent and the skill is concentrated in a few places. And so the question for all of us is, can we do innovation as quickly in that context? And there are a lot of things to do. That's a whole different discussion on the race on AI, but we shouldn't assume in an optimistic sense that dynamic continues. Like, we have to always be on our toes.
So you mean that the risk is that the knowledge about AI is concentrating into few points or few countries, maybe few regions, rather than spanned across the globe?
Absolutely.
But what we can do to avoid it?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it's what we're doing already now. First of all, there's a focus on skills, which we talked about in the previous panel, but it's a new set of skills. It may be not just core IT engineering skills, but data skills, the sort of interaction of soft and hard skills, a lot of change management. The second is infrastructure, and this is something where Europe has done a lot of work with the rest of the world to build more submarine cables, more data infrastructure, but also, of course, the data processing, the high-performance computing. And then there's a lot of regulatory work, because what gets in the way of adopting AI is a lot of pre-existing rules in different sectors. So healthcare is a good example. All the rules we have on healthcare data in Europe make it very challenging to build healthcare AI here. And so if you can't build it here, then it will be harder for us to catch up, to bring the capital, to bring the investors, and the people doing the innovation will consider going elsewhere. It's a very urgent question at this point.
My last question is going about regulations. Again, you said that Americans invent, Chinese are copying, Europeans are regulating. So we are very good in regulating everything. But if you are thinking that AI is pretty in immature phase, I should say, it's not still mature technology, at least in most of extent. So if we are regulating it right now, is it the risk that we are under regulations and cannot do that much, and others who are not regulating it can do much more? Or what should we regulate that?
So the short answer is yes. Europe has passed something called the AI Act. The AI Act has some very good things. A lot of it's about transparency. It's about sort of doing due diligence when you're training a model, doing due diligence when you put that model into practice. But there are two big mistakes in the AI Act. The first big mistake is we very explicitly ban AI in certain fields. And there are reasons to be concerned about facial recognition or automated decision-making, but to have an outright ban means that a lot of innovation that could, for instance, help correct human ethical lapses just won't happen. And the other is a bureaucracy around how we check whether people have followed these reasonable steps is quite overbearing. So I think we're going to have to find a balance, and the last 5 seconds, what Estonia has done well, and I hope that Europe and the rest of the world follows, is the best way to deal with the risks of technology is to have your hands dirty. Because if you're building things yourself with all these technologies, you will be able to deal with the risks as they arise.
So thank you very much, Luukas. Let's make hands dirty everywhere, not only in Estonia. And thank you very much, Luukas, for this great discussion.
Thank you.